was an agnostic and a humanist who didn't believe in God, and he only wrote one requiem, and it wasn't a very religious one. Verdi was an outspoken atheist. He was an altar boy who grew up to say, "Stay away from priests." He didn't say why, but maybe we can imagine. And Berlioz, and on and on. So in the second half of the book, The Good Atheist, has these Greek profiles that you can use to say, look, non-believers, atheists, agnostics, skeptics, whatever we call ourselves, lead lives of immense purpose, and happiness and morality and goodness. And a lot of the billboards that we see up here, a lot of the people put that I'm good without God. I don't need a God to scare me with hell to be good. If you do need that, then that shows how little you think of the people you're helping. You're doing it because you're scared of hell, right? I wouldn't do this otherwise, but I don't want to go to hell, so I'm going to help you, you know. Or the promise of heaven. That kind of shows how little you think of yourself. That I'm only going to be good because, well, I guess I'm going to get a reward for it. Most of us humanists and non-believers say, let's be good for goodness sake. Let's be good because it contributes to survival and to well-being. So, were some of you at the debate last night? And you came back? You weren't convinced that God exists because of the blue triangle, was it? I'm still thinking about that one. But another way that our lives can have meaning, and this is something that our foundation does primarily. We work to educate, which is part of our out of the closet campaign, but we also work to keep state and church separate, to keep religion and government apart from each other. And that is a job with which we were almost always joined by religious people, because there are many really good Protestants and Catholics and Jews in this country who really do know what morality is all about. They're really, well, I think most Christians are really good people. It's only the extreme people that were across the street like yesterday. It's only those extremists that give the rest of religion a bad name, and if you read the Bible literally, of course, it's the same. But the people themselves are really good people. And almost always when we make a complaint about state-church separation, we are joined by Catholics and by Protestants and by Jews and other believers who I feel like I'm missing one on there. Who agree that it's good for religion and government to be separate. Greg Boyd, who's the pastor of this huge megachurch in Minnesota, he and I have done a couple of debates together, and we actually like each other, which is kind of scary. He's really a really neat guy, and he's a musician. We talk about maybe we could start an ecumenical band. I could play piano, he could play drums, and we could find a Muslim. What do Muslims play? Guitar? If we could get a bass player, a Jewish bassist, wouldn't that be cool to have that truly? Actually, music can bring the world together. It really can. But Greg Boyd says America's not a Christian nation. He's a huge evangelical conservative pastor, and he's anti-abortion. He's I don't know if he's homophobic, but he's against gay marriage, and he's very conservative and all that stuff. And yet he thinks that if you mix religion and government, they both get dirty. And he realizes that he thinks the Christian message should not be using the power of the state or the government. It should be using persuasion in your lives. And I admire people like that. He's good, he's honest, he's on our side on state church. So the separation of church and state is not an atheist issue. It's an issue that all of us, whether you believe or don't believe, benefit from. So we've taken many cases over the years. One went to the Supreme Court in 2007, in which we lost not on the merits. We were challenging George Bush's faith-based initiative. We lost on standing. And there's a big difference there. Before you can even get into court to try a case, you have to prove that you have the standing to take the case, that you were injured in some way. I can't sue. If somebody violates your rights, I can't sue for you. You're the one who sued. You have to have the standing to bring the case. So we lost on standing, and it was a 5-4 decision. It would have been 5-4 our direction. We're really sure of this because when we first took the case, Sandra Day O'Connor was on the court, and she truly was a swing vote. But then, in the middle of our case, she was replaced by Alito on the Supreme Court, and and it ultimately went 5-4 against us, not on the merits. In fact, one of the justices said what George Bush was doing is probably wrong. It's unconstitutional for him to be using his presidential authority to be pushing religion, but that we just can't take the case. We can't sue. On our radio show that next week, after we found out that we had lost on standing, we played the song, "It don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing." Now that O'Connor was gone, then of course it's more of a right-leaning and not a swing court anymore. We can't have that. But the 4 justices who agreed with the 5, who were not a majority, they were 2 different, it was a plurality. They disagreed with each other even, but there was 5 against us. The 4 justices who agreed with us were quite vehement. It just doesn't make any sense. If we can't sue over that, who can, right? So the same thing is coming up in this National Day of Prayer issue. In 1952, Billy Graham, this big evangelist who's still alive. In fact, I told Jim that I am going to make a prediction that in the next decade, Billy Graham is going to die. God willing. So do I get $50,000 if that happens?
As long as you don't kill him.
As long as I don't kill him? Okay, you heard it. You all starting now. 750, okay, 10 years from now, we'll see. But in 1952, he was a young preacher, and the Hearst organization pushed this guy because he was very anti-communist. Really anti-communist. In fact, in Billy Graham's early crusades, he was even segregationist. He didn't allow people of color even into the crusades until around in the later 60s, then he started realizing maybe we should be a little more sensitive about this. A lot of his supporters were segregationists back then. So in 1952, Billy Graham went to Washington, D.C., and he had this huge, I think it was 6 weeks, it was a huge bunch of crusades, what a great word, crusades or revival meetings in Washington, D.C., partly at the National Armory, and a lot of them right on the steps of the Capitol. And there's photographs of all these huge people and Billy Graham preaching, communism is godlessness, and we need to bring our country back to God, and we need prayer. And he was cozy with a lot of members of Congress and all that. And so in 1952, Congress proposed a law introduced by a man named Absalom Robertson. And guess whose father he was? Pat Robertson's father. Absalom Robertson was a Southern segregationist senator, and he introduced this bill that requiring the president every year to issue a proclamation, a prayer proclamation to the country, which would be good for our country, to separate us, to make sure that God is on our side. The wording in the bill was very pro-religious and pro-Christian. Under constitutional principles, a secular government is only supposed to have a secular motive. A secular government is not supposed to have a pro-religious or anti-religious motive. Secular governments are only supposed to do secular things. Well, here's on the record, and we proved over and over again that when the bill was introduced back in '52 and voted on, it was all pro-Jesus, pro-Christian. Yes, we want to bring God back and Christianity back to this country. And in fact, if you look at the congressional record back then, Billy Graham's sermon is introduced into the congressional record. So it's a very evangelical Christian thing that happened back in '52. Every year since then, since Truman, the President of the United States has issued a proclamation, a prayer proclamation, calling on all Americans to pray. Not acknowledging, not accommodating, but calling on all Americans to pray. The religious right was really happy about that, you can imagine. And but as we look back to the history of it, we can see that sometimes the president forgot. And it was like the end of December, just before January, they would say, oh, we better do this prayer proclamation. So the religious right who wanted to make a big deal about this had to wait until it was proclaimed, and then they could have their big meetings and rallies and that. So there was this National Day of Prayer task force that started up. Pat Boone, the singer, Vonette Bright, who was Bill Bright's wife, they started Campus Crusade for Christ, all these evangelical type Christians. They had some political power. So in 1988, they went to Congress and proposed that that bill be amended so that instead of being whenever, that they would know when it was every year so they could plan better. And that was actually in the wording of this law. So that we Christians can plan our prayer events better, we would like it to be a fixed date. So in 1988, President Reagan signed the bill amending that law so that it would fall on the first Thursday of every May, which was, by the way, last Thursday. I forgot to mention, that's the reason that Annie Roy couldn't come was because on the National Day of Prayer, her dad died this week, and Annie Roy kind of was half joking, well, he wanted to die on the National Day of Prayer to show that prayer doesn't work. Paul Gator, it's sort of expected but very sad. He died Thursday, and so Annie Roy just couldn't come because of her mother and all these things. But last Thursday was the National Day of Prayer, and so ever since Reagan, then they were able to plan that first Thursday in May every single year. So then this National Day of Prayer Task Force, which is now being chaired by Shirley Dobson. Look at all these family names that are connected here. Shirley Dobson, is the wife of James Dobson, who runs Focus on the Family in Colorado Springs. The National Day of Prayer Task Force was housed in the same building in Colorado Springs with the Focus on the Family. So it's an evangelical Christian right thing, and they're really happy. And not only have they had this National Day of Prayer since 1988, but this National Day of Prayer Task Force has taken it upon itself to write the thing, to write the wording of it, to select the theme. This year the theme was "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," with the verse from Psalms 91 or 2, I think it was. And not only giving that to the White House to say, here's what your National Day of Prayer proclamation should be. It's a private religious group telling our president, here's what the proclamation should be. But then they send it to all the mayors, send it to as many all the governors. In fact, since that time, every governor, except once, there was one governor who refused to do it. Every governor in every 50, in all the states, has issued a National Day of Prayer proclamation in conjunction with the actual National Day of Prayer. Do you know which governor didn't do it?
Ventura.
Jesse Ventura, that's right. He said, and he was very smart about it, he said, what business of mine, I'm a civil leader here, what business do I have to direct people's private religious exercises? So that was to his credit, that was great. So for years, the Freedom from Religion Foundation has had people complaining about this. Every year this happens, and it's not just the president, the governors, and the mayors, but it's also sheriff's offices and anybody in government who wants to, cozy up to the religious right will have this thing. Well, a few years ago, we got a complaint from one of our members up in central Wisconsin about a sheriff who invited everybody to the sheriff's annual prayer breakfast on sheriff stationery, on official county stationery, sent out to everybody. And our member in town thought, that doesn't seem right. I mean, if the sheriff wants to go to pray, that's fine, but to actually make it an official function, that doesn't seem right. And they called us, as people are doing all the time, complaining about something. Stop them from doing that! That's just not right. So we investigated it, and it was a bad violation, and we complained. But that person in the county didn't want to be named as a plaintiff. That person got cold feet. And you can imagine in some parts of this country, it's pretty brave to be identified as the person who's challenging God, right? In fact, we've had to have protective orders in some of our lawsuits against some of the families that are complaining, because if the community knew who they were, it would be very dangerous, especially if there's children involved. So this person was not willing to come forward, and we couldn't do anything legal. We couldn't, threaten a lawsuit or sue unless we had a real live person with real standing to sue. Annie Laurie was really mad, and she's really frustrated about that. How can they get away with that? I mean, the Constitution is the Constitution. How can these renegades just do what they want and ignore the Constitution? Do we have to sue? Do we have to put out fires all over the whole country? Do we have to stop? Do we have to tell every county executive, every high school principal, by the way, the Constitution says this? Aren't they educated about that? When somebody takes public office, doesn't someone show them the Constitution and say, by the way, you're a public servant now, your hands are tied. You have free speech, you have your own private free speech, but when you're acting as the government, you don't have free speech. There's a difference between, and a lot of people confuse this, there's a difference between free speech and government speech. when an individual is speaking freely,